They thought bulldozing a century-old pecan grove would be the end of one old farmer's fight. Instead, it sparked a lawsuit that cost a powerful development company millions. This is the incredible, true-to-life story of courage, justice, and standing your ground. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. A gentle autumn breeze drifted across the rolling farmland of southern Georgia as golden sunlight filtered through towering pecan trees beneath a clear blue sky. Samuel Carter had lived on the same 50-acre farm for nearly his entire life. At 60 years old, he stood tall despite the stiffness that years of labor had left in his broad shoulders. Deep lines framed his weathered face, while a neatly trimmed gray beard and thick, silver-streaked brown hair reflected decades spent beneath the southern sun. His calm blue eyes carried a quiet sadness that had settled there after losing his wife Margaret 5 years earlier. Since then, Samuel had become a quieter man. Neighbors still respected his honesty and steady character, but grief had taught him to value silence more than conversation. Every morning before sunrise, he walked the orchard alone, gently brushing his rough hands across the bark of the oldest trees as though greeting lifelong friends. The southern section of the farm held Samuel's greatest treasure. More than 100 towering pecan trees stretched toward the sky, many growing from century-old root systems that his late father had carefully preserved before Samuel spent decades perfecting a unique disease-resistant pecan variety known for producing exceptionally rich, buttery kernels. Agricultural researchers had quietly registered the grove as an important genetic conservation site years earlier, and universities occasionally requested cuttings to support future breeding programs. To outsiders, they were simply old trees. To Samuel, every branch carried another chapter of his family's history. Only a few miles away, Benson Development Group announced plans for an enormous luxury subdivision that would surround Samuel's property. The company's president, Richard Benson, was a polished man in his early 50s with perfectly tailored suits, dark slicked-back hair, and a confident smile that rarely reached his calculating gray eyes. Years of winning aggressive business negotiations had convinced him that every problem could be solved with enough money or pressure. After studying the engineering plans, Richard discovered that Samuel's southern pecan grove sat directly across the cheapest route for the project's primary utility corridor. One crisp morning, Richard drove his gleaming black SUV onto the gravel driveway and offered Samuel several $1 million for the farm. Samuel listened politely before slowly shaking his head. This land had buried his parents, held his happiest memories, and carried generations of sacrifice. Some things, he believed, were simply never meant to be sold. Over the following 6 months, Richard Benson abandoned polite negotiations and replaced them with calculated pressure. County officials suddenly approved changes to a nearby drainage channel, sending heavy rainwater across Samuel Carter's northern pasture whenever storms rolled through southern Georgia. Anonymous complaints accused Samuel of operating noisy farm equipment before sunrise, even though local agricultural regulations clearly protected normal farming hours. Temporary construction fencing rose along the edge of the development, blocking the peaceful view Samuel had enjoyed for decades, while heavy machinery rumbled from dawn until dusk. The constant disruption was meant to wear down an old man who refused to surrender, but Samuel answered every setback with the same quiet determination. He repaired washed-out fences, cleared flooded ditches himself, and continued caring for his pecan grove exactly as his father had taught him. Late that autumn, encouraging news finally arrived. Magnolia Reserve Foods, a respected premium nut processor known throughout the Southeast for supplying luxury food brands, contacted Samuel after studying several university reports praising his unique pecan variety. Their purchasing director, Emily Foster, was a thoughtful woman in her early 40s with shoulder-length auburn hair, warm hazel eyes, and an honest reputation built from years of treating small family farmers fairly. Unlike many corporate buyers, Emily valued heritage agriculture above quick profits. After walking through the grove with Samuel and tasting the buttery pecans harvested from the century-old trees, She immediately offered a long-term purchasing agreement guaranteeing premium prices for every harvest over the next several years. The contract would provide Samuel with financial security while preserving the rare genetics for future generations. For the first time since Margaret's death, he allowed himself to imagine that the farm might survive long after he was gone. Richard Benson reacted very differently when his engineers informed him that Samuel's agreement had dramatically increased both the orchard's market value and its legal importance. Every additional month of delay forced Benson Development Group to spend enormous sums rerouting temporary infrastructure around the Carter property. Investors began demanding answers. Richard refused to redesign the subdivision because the Southern Grove remained the least expensive location for the project's primary underground utility corridor. Convinced that money alone would never persuade Samuel, he decided to manufacture an accident instead. Richard quietly contacted Jack Turner, owner of Turner Earthworks, an excavation company that had completed dozens of grading projects across Georgia. Jack was 55, powerfully built, with sunburned skin, thick dark whiskers flecked with gray, and a blunt personality shaped by 30 years of operating heavy equipment. He rarely questioned clients as long as contracts remained legal, and his crews were paid on time. Richard presented Jack with revised survey maps showing the Carter property line shifted several hundred feet south into the Pecan Grove. He explained that surveyors had recently corrected an old boundary error and instructed Jack to clear the marked area immediately once Samuel was away from the farm. The opportunity arrived only 2 weeks later, when Samuel drove to Atlanta for a scheduled cardiac examination. His physician insisted he could not postpone. Barely 30 minutes after his aging pickup disappeared beyond the highway, 3 massive bulldozers, excavators, and dump trucks rolled through an unlocked construction gate. Guided by the altered maps, Jack's operators drove straight through the fence, separating the development from Samuel's Southern Grove. Hydraulic blades bit into the ancient pecan trees one after another. Towering trunks crashed onto the earth with thunderous echoes, while enormous root systems, preserved through generations of careful grafting, were ripped violently from the soil. Research tags identifying valuable genetic lines disappeared beneath steel tracks as dust, splintered wood, and broken branches covered the ground. By early afternoon, the living heart of the Carter farm had become a scar of torn earth, leaving behind devastation that no ordinary harvest could ever repair. Samuel Carter returned from Atlanta shortly before sunset, expecting nothing more than another quiet evening beneath the shade of his beloved Pecan Grove. Instead, he froze the moment his truck reached the top of the gravel hill overlooking the southern orchard. The towering canopy that had stood there since his childhood was gone. In its place stretched acres of torn earth, shattered trunks, tangled roots, and deep bulldozer tracks. The familiar scent of ripening pecans had been replaced by diesel fumes and splintered wood. For several long moments, Samuel could neither breathe nor move. The silence around him felt heavier than any words could carry. He slowly walked through the destruction, his weathered boots sinking into loose soil. One enormous tree lay across the ground with its ancient root system exposed to the evening air. Samuel rested a trembling hand against the broken trunk, remembering the day his father had taught him how to graft young branches onto that very rootstock. Years of memories flooded through his mind until a familiar voice interrupted the silence. Richard Benson stepped from his polished black SUV, wearing another expensive tailored suit that looked strangely clean against the ruined landscape. His expression carried practiced sympathy, but his cold gray eyes revealed quiet satisfaction. Holding a prepared envelope, he approached Samuel with measured confidence. "Mr. Carter," Richard said softly, "this was an unfortunate surveying mistake. These things happen on large construction projects." He removed a certified check worth $20,000 and extended it toward the older farmer. "This should more than cover the value of the pecan timber and the cleanup." Samuel looked at the check without reaching for it. To Richard, those trees were lumber measured by the cord. To Samuel, they represented generations of sacrifice, knowledge, and family history. Without saying a word, He turned away and continued searching through the wreckage. Near one of the uprooted root systems, a small metal identification tag caught the fading sunlight. Bent but still attached to a shattered branch, the weathered marker displayed a federal registration number issued years earlier by the National Plant Germplasm System. Samuel carefully wiped away the mud and stared at the engraved code. His breathing steadied. Richard had believed he had destroyed nothing more than ordinary pecan trees. In reality, the bulldozers had erased a federally documented genetic conservation grove containing decades of selective breeding and irreplaceable biological material. The following morning, Samuel drove to Macon and entered the office of Daniel Brooks. Daniel, 62, was a respected agricultural attorney with neatly combed silver hair, a square jaw softened by age, and thoughtful brown eyes behind thin wire-rimmed glasses. Raised on a peanut farm before studying law, he understood both legal statutes and the emotional weight farmers attached to their land. He listened without interruption while Samuel placed decades of breeding journals, university correspondence, federal registration certificates, research agreements, and the rejected $20,000 check across his desk. Daniel examined every document slowly before leaning back in silence. Finally, a faint smile crossed his face. "They've made a mistake far bigger than they realize," he said calmly. Within days, Daniel assembled a team of specialists. Dr. Nathan Collins, a nationally respected pecan geneticist with neatly trimmed white hair and decades of university research behind him, documented every destroyed tree and traced the breeding history preserved in Samuel's records. Forestry valuation experts calculated the replacement cost of the century-old root systems, while agricultural economist Laura Mitchell, a composed woman in her late 40s known for advising federal conservation programs, analyzed the long-term financial impact. She included future harvests, exclusive licensing opportunities, research partnerships, and Samuel's newly signed premium supply agreement with Magnolia Reserve Foods. After 2 exhaustive weeks, the experts delivered their final report. The grove's value extended far beyond timber or a single season's crop. The destruction had eliminated irreplaceable genetics, decades of scientific development, federally recognized conservation resources, and future commercial income that could never truly be restored. The combined damages exceeded $5 million. When Daniel closed the report, he looked directly at Samuel. "And because this appears to have been a deliberate destruction of protected trees on private property," he said quietly, "Georgia law may allow the court to multiply every dollar of those damages." 3 weeks after receiving the final valuation report, Daniel Brooks filed a civil lawsuit against Benson Development Group seeking more than $15 million in damages. The complaint detailed every destroyed tree, every documented genetic record, every broken commercial agreement, and every federal conservation certificate that had been wiped away beneath the bulldozers. News of the lawsuit spread quickly across Georgia's farming communities. Local growers, university researchers, and conservation organizations quietly followed the case, recognizing that its outcome could affect the protection of agricultural heritage throughout the state. Richard Benson refused to admit responsibility. Publicly, he described the incident as nothing more than an unfortunate surveying mistake committed by an independent contractor. Inside the company, however, panic had replaced confidence. Investors questioned the future of the luxury subdivision, while lenders demanded explanations for the growing legal exposure. Richard insisted that Turner Earthworks had acted without authorization, attempting to shift every ounce of blame onto Jack Turner. When Jack learned that Benson Development intended to sacrifice his company to protect its executives, years of professional loyalty disappeared overnight. Although he had built a reputation for honoring every construction contract, Jack believed a man's word only mattered if it was returned with honesty. Feeling betrayed, he contacted Daniel Brooks and agreed to cooperate fully. The trial began the following spring inside the Bibb County Courthouse. Presiding over the case was Judge Rebecca Morgan, a woman in her late 60s with neatly styled silver hair, sharp green eyes, and an unwavering reputation for demanding honesty inside her courtroom. Earlier in her career, she had spent nearly 2 decades handling complex property disputes, earning respect for carefully separating genuine mistakes from deliberate misconduct. Her calm voice rarely rose, yet every attorney understood that misleading her invited severe consequences. Richard entered the courtroom wearing another expensive Navy suit, but the confidence that had once defined him had disappeared. Months of public criticism and financial pressure had left dark circles beneath his gray eyes. Across the aisle, Samuel Carter sat quietly beside Daniel Brooks. He wore his best brown jacket, his weathered hands resting calmly on the table. He had not come seeking revenge. He had come seeking accountability. The defense argued that Turner Earthworks had misunderstood outdated survey maps and accidentally crossed the property boundary. Their attorneys insisted that Benson Development had acted in good faith and had even offered immediate compensation after discovering the error. Daniel responded by calling Jack Turner to the witness stand. The large contractor walked slowly toward the courtroom microphone, his broad shoulders squared, despite the tension filling the room. After taking the oath, he reached into his briefcase and removed a folded set of survey maps. "These are not the originals," Jack testified firmly. "Mr. Benson handed me these revised copies the morning before the clearing." He explained that the permanent survey stakes already marking Samuel's property clearly contradicted the maps. When he questioned the discrepancy, Richard dismissed his concerns. "He told me to ignore the stakes," Jack continued, looking directly toward the jury. His exact words were, "Clear every tree. Let the lawyers handle the rest." Daniel then introduced printed text messages exchanged between Richard and Jack before the demolition. The messages discussed bonus payments once the grove had been removed. Bank records confirmed that Richard had authorized an additional transfer to Jack's company immediately after the work was completed. Combined with the altered maps, the evidence destroyed every claim that the clearing had been accidental. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Benson Development Group had knowingly and intentionally destroyed protected property belonging to Samuel Carter. Judge Rebecca Morgan quietly reviewed the findings before delivering her decision. "The court finds the defendants fully liable for willful destruction of protected agricultural property," she announced. "Treble damages shall apply under the governing statute." The final judgment exceeded $15 million, together with legal costs and additional fees. The consequences reached far beyond the courtroom. Banks immediately suspended financing for Benson Development's unfinished subdivision. Investors withdrew their remaining capital within days. Construction stopped across every active project. And only months later, the once powerful company entered bankruptcy proceedings. Richard Benson was removed from his position, barred from several professional real estate organizations, and soon faced additional lawsuits who claimed his deliberate misconduct had destroyed the company they had trusted him to lead. The court's judgment changed Samuel Carter's finances, but it never changed the man himself. Long after reporters stopped calling and television crews disappeared from the gravel road leading to his farm, Samuel continued waking before sunrise, brewing the same black coffee, and walking across the quiet fields that had shaped his entire life. He had never wanted millions of dollars. He had only wanted justice for a grove that could never truly be replaced. As Benson Development Group entered bankruptcy, its unfinished luxury subdivision became a financial burden that lenders desperately wanted to sell. Through Daniel Brooks, Samuel quietly purchased most of the surrounding 300 acres for a fraction of what the developers had once paid. Many people expected him to build his own profitable community or sell the land to another corporation. Instead, he announced a very different future. Samuel invited professors from the University of Georgia College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences to visit the damaged property. Among them was Dr. Olivia Grant, a 50-year-old horticulturist with sun-kissed skin, short chestnut hair lightly streaked with gray, and thoughtful blue eyes that reflected decades spent studying heritage tree genetics rather than sitting inside laboratories. Patient, practical, and deeply respected by both scientists and farmers. Olivia had devoted much of her career to preserving disappearing crop varieties after watching several historic orchards vanish during rapid urban expansion. She immediately understood that Samuel's surviving grafts represented something far more valuable than a local farming success. They were living pieces of agricultural history. Together, they established the Carter Pecan Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving rare pecan genetics, supporting agricultural education, and helping family farms protect heritage crops from disappearing forever. Before any new trees were planted, abandoned roads were removed, cracked concrete foundations were broken apart, and construction debris left behind by the failed subdivision was carefully cleared away. The scarred landscape slowly began to resemble farmland once again. Inside Samuel's greenhouse, several living grafts and healthy root fragments, rescued before the demolition, had survived against every expectation. Working with university researchers, Olivia supervised years of careful propagation until young saplings carrying the original Carter genetic line were ready for planting. Each winter, hundreds of local volunteers gathered to place another generation of pecan trees into the restored fields. High school agriculture students worked beside retired farmers. University researchers exchanged knowledge with families who had cultivated the land for generations. Samuel never considered himself anyone's hero. He simply walked among the volunteers, offering quiet advice, demonstrating old grafting techniques his father had once taught him, believing that wisdom became meaningful only when it was shared. 5 years later, more than 10,000 young pecan trees stretched across the rolling countryside where expensive houses, golf courses, and shopping streets had once been planned. The foundation welcomed visitors from across the United States. Farmers attended workshops on heritage crop preservation. Graduate students conducted long-term genetic research. Children toured the sanctuary each spring, learning that protecting the land sometimes required courage as much as hard work. One cool autumn afternoon, Samuel stood beneath the broad branches of a thriving young pecan tree grown directly from one of the rescued grafts. The breeze carried the familiar rustle of healthy leaves across fields now filled with life once again. Around him, thousands of trees reached steadily toward the Georgia sky, their roots spreading deeper with every passing season. Samuel smiled quietly, knowing that no courtroom victory had truly been his greatest achievement. Wealth would eventually disappear, buildings would rise and fall, companies would be forgotten, but the living legacy growing around him would continue nourishing families, educating future farmers, and preserving generations of knowledge long after every trace of the corporation that tried to erase it had vanished from memory. Sometimes the greatest victories are not measured by money, but by what we choose to protect when no one else believes it still matters. In our own lives, we all have something precious, a family tradition, a cherished memory, a dream, or simply the quiet belief that doing the right thing is worth the effort. Those things may never make headlines, but they shape who we are and what we leave behind. If Samuel's story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a little hope today. We'd also love to hear from you. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about courage, kindness, and ordinary people making an extraordinary difference, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing community. May God bless you, protect you, and fill your home with peace, good health, and hope. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you in the next story.